The highest temperatures that were measured in the South Tower were around 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, but still way, way below what would have been required. Now, what's interesting about the fall of the buildings is the order in which they fell. The South Tower fell at 10 a.m., actually 9:59, after only 56 minutes from impact. So it was only 56 minutes of exposure at temperatures that were far too low to actually melt steel before the building came down. The North Tower, however, was exposed for an hour and 37 minutes. So it's very curious that the building which was exposed to these fires, which are alleged to be the cause of the collapse of the building, fell in the wrong order. They fell in the wrong order. If it was actually the heat from the fires that is supposed to precipitate their falling, then the North Tower, which was hit first, should have fallen first. But it was the South Tower, which was hit second, that fell first. There are many indications of the nature of the collapse that are rather stunning. There's a tremendous amount of steel girders that are thrown outwards. You can see a lot of them here in the dust and debris cloud. The way in which the buildings fell was quite stunning because they fell into their own footprint. This is rather remarkable on several counts, considering that vastly more damage would have been done to Lower Manhattan if these 110-story buildings had fallen somehow askew and onto other buildings. They not only fell into their own footprint, but they fell in such a way that most of the steel was in 30-foot segments, which made it very easy to load aboard vehicles, and most of the steel was in fact very promptly removed by an extremely efficient company by the name of Controlled Demolition. Now here's further indication of what's going on, and it is stunning how the massive concrete, there's a huge quantity of concrete here, was pulverized, turned into very fine powder. Now, if these buildings had come down, as the government contends, by virtue of this pancake effect, there should have been a tremendous pile, a residue of concrete chunks, concrete boulders and all that. No such was found. In fact, this concrete was turned into very fine dust, which required a tremendous amount of greater amount of explosives than the energy that would have been released by the pancaking effect of the building. Moreover, and this is quite stunning too, the rate at which the buildings fell is perhaps most remarkable. I mentioned Galileo's law of free fall. If you had dropped, say, a billiard ball from the top of the World Trade Center, 110 floors up there, it would have taken 8 to 10 seconds to hit the ground, encountering no resistance whatsoever. There is no scenario for a pancake effect of buildings falling that allows them to fall at the rate of free fall. If you were just to surmise, hypothetically as an approximation, that they would take a second for each floor to collapse, and if you were talking about the whole 110 floors, that would represent 110 seconds, or 100 seconds too many. If you assume that, well, yeah, but the one hit on the 96th floor, so we're only talking about collapse from the 96th floor, that would still be 96 seconds if you're assuming a second per collapse per floor. Now, an engineer in California suggests that a second is too high, that it may have only taken a half a second in order for the mass, the weight of the upper floors to overcome the resistance of the lower floors, and suggests that a half a second. Well, if you take a half a second into 96 floors, then you get 48 seconds it should have taken for the building to fall. Yet they only fell in 8 to 10 seconds, far too fast. Similarly, hitting the 80th floor of the other trade tower would have required 40 seconds if you had a half a second per floor. Far too fast for the 8 to 10 seconds that they fell. I mean, it's not even physically possible that the buildings could have fallen in accordance with the government's claim. Moreover, and although it doesn't show it here, but in other footage that you'll find on the video clips that I mentioned, there was a tremendous explosion in the sub-basements. These sub-basements run 7 and 8 floors below the ground. There was tremendous explosion in the sub-basements that was even recorded on seismographs run by Columbia University about 8 or 9 seconds before the building started to fall. About 8 or 9 seconds, that is to say, before the planes impacted with the buildings. The tremendous explosions in the sub-basement. I mean, really dramatic stuff.
Right in the basement, you felt it. Walls were caving in, everything that was going on. I mean, I know of people that got killed in the basement. I know of people that got broken legs in the basement. People that got reconstructive surgery because the walls hit them in the face.
And we have some workers who were there that were damaged by these sub-basement explosions, and talk about a 50-ton hydraulic press, for example, that was completely obliterated in the explosion. And if you look at the film footage of the explosions, you find all over the place there's these little plumes of smoke breaking out called spools that are symptomatic of a controlled demolition. Here's a spool, see how it extends. Here's another, see how it extends. Here's another, see how it extends. And we wound up with this mass of steel that was surprisingly easy to remove because so much of it was of a relatively uniform size, around 30-foot lengths, really quite remarkable. And they started cleaning up the site almost immediately. Now the claim was made, and you can find this in the 9/11 Commission report, that the center of the buildings was all hollowed out. But the only part of the center of the buildings was all hollowed out were the actual elevator shafts. There were in fact 47 steel columns at the center of each of these buildings. 47 steel columns at the center of these buildings, and on the perimeter there were no less than 240 steel columns. And you certainly would have expected them to be projecting upward if the building had fallen. It would have been very asymmetrical. It would have been a very different kind of collapse than occurred here. Here's some early photographs in the construction of these buildings. They were really marvels of engineering. These were brilliantly conceived buildings, and they were built in the full knowledge that it might be the case that they have to resist the impact of aircraft. Here is Frank DiMartini, who was the chief engineer on one of the towers, who reported that they were constructed in such a fashion and they were so resilient that the impact of the largest known commercial aircraft at the time, a Boeing 707, would be like sticking a pencil through mosquito netting.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
And I found 3 other engineers who played primary roles in the project who say the same thing. This guy, Frank DiMartini, was killed on 9/11 when the buildings collapsed. Here's a comparison of the Boeing 707 with the 767. They're very similar in their dimensions, in their maximum takeoff weight, maximum fuel capacity, cruise speeds, and the like. These are very similar aircraft. Let me mention, by the way, that this is the first and only time in history that any steel structure, skyscrapers, are ever collapsed due to fire. It has never before been recorded in the history of structural engineering, before or since. So the government is asking us to believe that on this one day, 9/11, as it were, the laws of physics were suspended and phenomena never before known to structural engineering were taking place just in this exact location. Here is World Trade Center building number 7. This was a 47-story skyscraper, which if it hadn't been surrounded by 110-story buildings would have been regarded as quite a substantial building. This building fell at 5:25 p.m., never having been hit by any aircraft and only having sustained 2 relatively small fires. And it was brought down by what we know was a controlled demolition, because Larry Silverstein, who had leased the World Trade Center about 6 months before all these events took place and insured the buildings at quite a substantial chunk of money in the billions of dollars, for which he then collected twice by insisting it was 2 different attacks, had a conversation with somebody he described as the chief of police, where Silverstein reported, he told the chief, well, there's been so much death and destruction, maybe the best thing we can do is pull it.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Where the term pulling, of course, in construction means take it down by controlled demolition. This building came down perfectly symmetrical, fell into its own footprint. Absolutely crystal clear that that is what happened to World Trade Center 7. The best that the 9/11 Commission could do was to say that the only scenario they had for its collapse was highly improbable. What that means is they couldn't explain it. What that means is if they did explain it, it would raise too many important questions about whether the other buildings, whose collapse was so very similar to the collapse of World Trade Center number 7, hadn't been from similar causes. In this case, notice, in order to pull the building, there had to be pre-positioned explosives. The building could not have been pulled unless there were pre-positioned explosives, which raises the very appropriate question, does that mean there could have been pre-positioned explosives in the World Trade Center? Well, there have been a lot of reports of oddities involving security in the weeks leading up to 9/11. The agency that responsible for its security is a company named Securicom. A director of the agency, which not only was responsible for security at the World Trade Center, but also at Dulles Airport and for United Airlines, was none other than Marvin Bush, the president's brother.
He's joining us now, the co-chairman of Scholars for 9/11 Truth, Professor Emeritus at the University of Minnesota at Duluth, James Fetzer.